guys for making the time to chat today. I really appreciate it. While unfortunately we can't be in person given the pandemic, regardless of what city or town or area we live in, we all have something very much in common, which is that we all have something that we want to change. And in this particular instance, while there may be other things you want to change in your life and other aspects you want to think about, in here, we're all interested in changing something in particular, right? We want to help support women during a difficult point in their lives, and we want to figure out how to do that better. But it's a very politicized issue, right? There's a lot of strong opinions on both sides, and it often feels like rather than listening to one another, there's lots of people yelling. And so how do we change minds in a difficult situation? And could there be a better way to go about it? Right? Often when trying to change minds, whether in this particular situations or other ones, whether to change a colleague's mind or a friend's mind or change a child's behavior, often we think about pushing. We think about facts and reasons. And if we just persuade people a little bit more, a little bit better, they'll come around. But as I'll talk about today, pushing often doesn't work. And it turns out there's a better way to change minds and drive action. And by understanding that better way, we can be more effective in a variety of areas of our lives. I don't think this was mentioned already, but I'm Professor Jonah Berger. I'm a marketing professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. And what I'm going to do today is give you a brief tour of my recent New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestseller, The Catalyst: How to Change Anyone's Mind. It's all about the science of why we change and why we don't, and how by understanding that science, we can make others and even ourselves a little bit more likely to move. And so my goal today is very simple. Around the hour we have together, my goal is to sort of lay out a new way to think about change, give you a framework, a set of directions to begin to think about applying those ideas, and then go deeply, at least into a couple of those areas and how to apply them. We won't have time today in an hour to go through all aspects of the framework and the ideas, but we'll go into a couple in depth, and I hope to leave you with at least 2, 3, maybe even 4 or 5 things that you can do tomorrow to start changing minds. I will certainly save time for questions at the end. So please start thinking about questions as we're talking. In these sorts of things, I love to use the chat function as a way to share ideas. And so if you have questions along the way or other things along the way, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A in the chat. I may not be able to get to them right away, but I will try to get to them at least at the end of the conversation. And I want to describe today very much as a hero's journey. You're the hero, right? You have something that you're hoping to change. You have an outcome you're hoping to achieve. You are the hero of that journey. But as in any hero's journey, as in any difficult journey, there's a villain. And in this case, the villain has a very particular name, and that is called the status quo bias. Have any of you heard of the status quo bias? Anybody want to share? If you have any thoughts about what the status quo bias is or might be, want to either type them in the chat or the Q&A. Any idea what that term means, the status quo bias? I'll give you guys just a second to think about it. So in case you haven't heard of it before, the status quo bias is actually a pretty simple term. It says what it means, which is we have a bias towards the status quo. What does that mean? Oh, sorry, I spoke too quickly here. Current practice, the norm, I prefer the comfort of what I know. Yes, both Teddy and Jane, both of those are quite good suggestions. Thank you. And inertia, Janine, I like your suggestion there. A body at rest remains at rest. That's a really good way to describe it, right? Any time in our lives when we're making a decision, a choice, let's think of simple things, whether to buy a new product or use a new service, whether to adopt a new innovation or program, a new way of thinking about things. We have a decision. We can stick with the stuff that we've done before, or we can do something new. And what the status quo bias says, as your colleagues nicely suggested, this idea of inertia, is bodies at rest tend to stay at rest. We tend to stick with the things we've been doing before. In a consumer context, we tend to buy the same products and services. right? Think about when you go to the grocery store, for example, you tend to buy the same things again and again. You don't buy exactly the same things every week, though you buy a lot of the same things every week. At my house, it's always milk and bananas. But notice it's not only that, it's the same brand of milk each week in the same size and the same number of bananas each week. Not different type of fruit, same exact thing. Right? Different weeks you make different recipes, but when you look for a certain ingredient, you often buy the same brand of that ingredient. That's an example of the status quo bias. There might be a new product at the grocery store that looks quite good, looks quite interesting, but we're not so sure about it, right? The old thing feels safe. We're attached to things we already know, right? In the context of homes, for example, the longer someone's lived in a home, the more they value that home above market price. So when it comes around to sell that home, the more someone's lived in a home, the longer they've lived there, the more valuable they think that home is, even above appreciation that it actually has, because they become attached to it. I don't have to tell you the same thing holds for our attitudes and our opinions, right? If I have a certain attitude or a certain opinion, that is the status quo. That's the opinion or attitude I have at the moment. Going to be very hard to get me to budge off that. Why? Because old things seem familiar. They feel safe. I know them already. I've thought a lot about them. I feel like they're right. As we'll talk about today, our existing opinions color how we view information in particularly in a very politicized debate like the discussion around abortion, right? I'm at a certain place. I have a certain opinion. My willingness to consider new information is very much shaped and biased by my existing set of beliefs. And in addition, new things always involve uncertainty. We won't talk about that in depth today, but I talk about that some in the book more broadly. Think about that new product at the grocery store, for example. Sure, it looks like it might be good, but how do I know it's actually good? Right? Am I going to know the right way to cook it? Am I going to know the right way to use it? And so I'm a little bit wary of doing new things. All of these are examples of the status quo bias. We tend to stick with the stuff that we know because it feels safe, and we tend to avoid new things because they're often uncertain. And so one question then is, well, how do we overcome this villain? How do we overcome the status quo bias? How do we get people to move and budge even when that's not something they're interested in doing? And by the way, I want to be very clear. Um, uh, I think we think our change issue is difficult, and it is, but this is part of a much broader principle. I'm going to share examples today from a variety of different domains, from attitudes and consumer situations, and even political ones, to show that it's not just about the issue we're facing, it's about the psychology or behavioral science behind change. If we're only focused on the issue we're interested in, we're going to get caught up a little bit in some of the details, and the details are important. But underneath those details is a cognitive architecture, a way of thinking about things that pervade a variety of types of decisions that we make. And the more we understand about how that works, the more effective we can be in helping people make better decisions and moving them in the right direction. And so, okay, if we have the status quo bias, well, how do we change it, right? And often when we try to change people, often when we try to change minds, we take a very particular or specific approach. And that is some version of what I call pushing, right? So if we're having an online debate with someone, we think, oh, if I just list some facts or some reasons, they'll come around. If I just give them the right emotional appeal or share more with them about why my perspective is right, they'll change the way they think about things. If we're talking about an offline friend or colleague, well, if I just call them one more time, if I just have one more conversation with them, if I just help them see where I'm coming from, if I help them see the right answer, if I just show them the light, they'll come around. And it's clear why we think that, right? We know a lot about our opinions, our ideas, and we think we're right. But the challenge is they also think that they're right. And by focusing on ourselves, we miss something quite important. It's clear why we think pushing works, right? Take the physical world, for example, to go back, you guys mentioned inertia in the physical world. So I'll use an example of a physical world here. Pushing works great in the physical world. If you have a chair in the middle of a room and you want that chair to move, pushing that chair is a great way to get it to go. Pushing with force in one particular direction, the chair slides across the room. But when we apply that same intuition to people, we run into a problem. Any idea what that problem is? Sure, pushing chairs works really well, but when we push people, do they just slide along? Or if not, what happens? What happens when we push people? Yeah, so someone nicely said, people push back, right? People don't just go along. They think about all the reasons why they don't want to do what we're suggesting, right? They dig in their heels and they become less likely to do what we want to do rather than more. And so if pushing doesn't work, what does? Well, it turns out there's a very interesting analogy to be made with a very different domain, and that is chemistry. So I don't know if any of you have a background in chemistry, or you can think back to your high school days where you took chemistry in high school. But as you may remember, chemical change is really hard, right? If we think about squeezing carbon into diamonds over millions of years, or turning plant matter eventually into oil, it takes lots of effort to create chemical change. And so chemists often add temperature and pressure to make change easier, right? If you squeeze something together in the lab, if you heat it up in the lab, change is more likely to happen, right? Think about making popcorn, for example. You ever seen those little popcorn kernels, right? You can stare at them all you want on your counter. They're not really going to turn into popcorn. So what do you need to do? You put them in the microwave, you heat them up, right? In that case, more temperature. And what it does, it heats up the moisture inside the kernel, eventually cracks the kernel, and out pops the popcorn, right? Heating it up creates more pressure, which eventually breaks, and the popcorn comes out. And so we apply the same idea when we think about people. If we just pressure them a little bit more, heat them up a little bit, put more effort, energy into the system, they'll change. But it turns out in chemistry, there's a better way to make change happen. There's a better and faster way to make change happen, not with more energy, but less. There's a special set of substances that chemists often add to reactions to make change happen faster and easier. These special substances are in everything from how you clean your contact lenses to the grime on your car's engine, and multiple Nobel Prizes have been won for innovations in this space. And these substances, very simply, are called catalysts. And as we think about catalysts in the social world, as we think about the way we use catalysts in our daily life, the way we use that word, we often talk about catalysts as just a change agent. And catalysts, yeah, catalysts are change agents. But the analogy goes deeper than that, because in chemistry, catalysts aren't just change agents. They create change in a very particular way. They don't push harder, they don't add more temperature and more pressure. What they do is they take those red arrows and they lower them. They mitigate or reduce the barrier to change by making change then faster and easier, not by pushing more, but by getting rid of the barriers. What great catalysts in the social world do, they don't say, well, what could I do to get someone to change, which is very focused on us and the outcome we want to achieve. Instead, what great catalysts do is they say, well, why hasn't that person changed already? What's stopping them? What's getting in their way? What are the barriers or obstacles that are preventing them from changing? And how can I mitigate them? Because we can push as hard as we want, but if we don't understand the person we're trying to change, we don't understand why they don't want to change, it's going to be really hard to get them to move. In some sense, we have to start with the root. We've got to understand the underlying issue. Think about a doctor, for example. When you walk into a doctor's office, a doctor doesn't start by saying, okay, well, let me put a cast on your leg. That'd be ridiculous, right? A doctor starts by saying, well, let me diagnose the situation. Let me understand what's challenging you, what the issues are, and by understanding them, make it easier to change. Only once I've diagnosed the problem can we reach a solution. And the same thing is true in change more generally, right? Really hard to change people if we don't understand why they're not interested in moving, right? Too often we just want to push people and get them to move. But if we don't understand why they don't want to change, why they're stuck in their ways, why they feel the way that they do, it's going to be really hard to get them to move. Another good analogy, I think, is almost as a car, right? So imagine you're parked in a car on an incline, right? You're parked in a car on an incline, you get in your car, you want to get it to go, you stick your key in the ignition, you turn your key, you step your foot on the gas. If the car doesn't go, we think we just need more gas. If we just push harder on the gas, the car will move. If we just push people harder, they'll move, right? But too often when we're in that situation in the car, too often when we're in that situation with people, right, we forget about the parking brake. If that parking brake is pulled up, it doesn't matter how much we're going to step on the gas, people, cars aren't going to budge. And so what I want to talk about today is how we can be better at finding the parking brakes. How can we be better at identifying those barriers, those obstacles, those hurdles to change and mitigate them? Again, if we don't understand what the obstacles are, it's going to be really tough to get people to move. How can we find those parking brakes and be better at change as a result? And in doing work for this book, I talked to a range of experts. I talked to everything from top-selling salespeople and transformational leaders, politicians who got people to switch sides from Democrat Republicans and vice versa. And I talked to a range of experts from hostage negotiators and substance abuse counselors, parenting experts, and everybody in between, right? And I found again and again, the same 5 barriers came up, right? The same 5 barriers came up again and again. And in the catalyst, I put them in a framework that stands for reactants, endowments, distance, uncertainty, and corroborating evidence. Put them together, they spell a word, and that word is reduce, which is exactly what catalysts do. Great catalysts don't push people harder. Great catalysts don't add more facts, more figures, more reasons, more information. They identify the barriers and they reduce them. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'll talk about a couple of the key barriers that come up again and again, and how by mitigating them, we can make change more likely. Before I get there, though, thank you, Martha, for putting a question into the chat. I appreciate it. And so I just want to go ahead and answer it briefly. And Martha raises a good point. She said there's a difference between pushing and giving new information. Many people do not know important information. And I want to be very careful here. I agree that some people don't know important information, but that's actually not the key question. The question is not whether they don't know key information. The question is whether the barrier to change is lack of information. Because sometimes lack of information is the barrier to change. Sometimes people don't know information that if they just knew that information, they would come around. And so the barrier is information. But too often, we assume information is the barrier when it really isn't. We assume that if we just give people more information, they'll change. But often the barrier isn't actually information, right? We think it is, but it isn't. And so the challenge I want us to get better at is identifying those barriers. I very much agree with Marta. There are huge knowledge gaps. There are situations where there's lots of information people don't know. But just because they don't know it doesn't mean that's what's preventing them from changing, right? Too often we assume it's about information when it's really about something else, when it's about uncertainty, when it's about distance, when it's about reactants, when it's about something else. And so I definitely agree there are times where information is the problem. And if information is a problem, let's bring that tool out of our toolkit and provide that information. But in cases where information is not the problem, which is actually many more cases than we realize, we need to pull out a different tool. Right? It's like if you have a toolkit and you have a hammer and you have a screwdriver and you have a saw and you have something else, different tools are good for different things, right? If you want to saw a board in half, keep pulling out that hammer is not going to work. And too often when we have a really good hammer, we think everything's a nail. And sometimes things are nails, but sometimes they're not, right? And so that's what we'll talk about today. So to help us get there, I want to focus today on 2 key barriers. I'm going to focus on reactants and distance. If there's time, I'm happy to talk about the others and definitely willing to answer them in the Q&A. And so I'll start in going into reactants. And to do that, I want to start talking about these. Does anyone recognize what these are? Anyone recognize what these things on the screen in front of you are? This is an easy one, guys. Let me see. What do folks say? Jane said Tide Pods. Teddy said detergent pods. Dish towel, soap, detergent. Good. So many of you are right. These are pods. In particular, these are a type of pods that go in your washing machine called Tide Pods, but they're a version of the pods that you've seen before. And so I want to tell you a little story about these pods. So a number of years ago, Tide, owned by Procter & Gamble, wanted to make laundry easier. Doing laundry wasn't that difficult, but there are a couple barriers or things that get in the way, annoyances that get in the way, right? You never know exactly how much detergent to use. Yeah, sometimes you pour it and it spills and it gets on the counter, it's sticky. And it actually turns out that some of the detergent would be better going in early and others of it would be better going in later, but there's no way to do that with the liquid. And so Tide spent some money, did some R&D, and came up with a solution called Tide Pods. They spent $100 million on marketing, and they hope to take a big chunk of the over $1 billion laundry industry. So Tide Pods come out and they're doing okay, but then there's a problem. Does anyone remember what one of the problems with Tide Pods was? What one of the issues was? Anyone remember what one of the issues was? Let's see here. A couple of you are chiming in. Yeah, people were eating them, right? And some of you are sitting there going, well, what do you mean people are eating them? Aren't they filled with chemicals? Yes, they are. Propylene glycol, alcohol, ethoxy, sulfate, a bunch of different things. Yes, they're filled with chemicals. And yes, people were eating them, right? This was called the Tide Pod Challenge. There was a funny video online saying they look good enough to eat. There was a piece in College Humor taking pictures of melted Tide Pods on top of pizza saying they look delicious. And suddenly people, mostly young people, were challenging one another to eat Tide Pods. It was called the Tide Pod Challenge. Okay. Now, this is obviously ridiculous, but imagine you're a Tide executive in this situation. You're going, well, people should know not to do this, but just in case, let me give them more information. right? Let me take out my information hammer and give them more information. And so they took out, released a big press release saying, don't eat Tide Pods. Let me list all the reasons why eating Tide Pods is a terrible idea. They listed information. They gave people reasons. They thought that would be enough. Just in case it's not enough, we'll hire a celebrity, Rob Gronkowski of New England Patriots, once fame, now Tampa Bay Buccaneers fame, to shoot a public service announcement saying, don't eat Tide Pods. Safe to eat Tide Pods? No, 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 no. All sorts of information, right? Got that information hammer, bring it out, everything looks like a nail. And so this is what search data looks like for the Tide Pod Challenge over time, okay? Slowly creeping up until the point that Tide releases this announcement. Now, Tide hopes that releasing this announcement will stem interest in the Tide Pod Challenge. People will stop searching for it, kids will realize it's a bad idea, and they won't do it. But that's not what happened. In fact, the exact opposite happened. Searches for the Tide Pod Challenge go up over fourfold. It's not just parents wondering what their kids are up to. Visits to poison control go up as well. In the next 2 weeks, more than 2 times the number of people came into poison control than had in the 2 years prior. Very simply, a warning became a recommendation. Telling people not to do something actually made them more likely to do it. Now, you're probably sitting there going, well, hold on, right? I mean, I don't know if we're telling people not to do something. Maybe we are. Maybe we're telling people to do something. We're certainly telling people to change their mind, but I don't really care about Tide Pods and the Tide Pod Challenge. What does this have to do with me? Well, this is actually just one example of a much broader phenomenon, which is called reactants. When pushed, whether pushed to do something or pushed not to do something, people push back. They often do the exact opposite of what we want them to do. And so I want to spend a couple minutes talking about reactants, what it is, why it happens, and what we can do to deal with it. Right? And if any of you have kids, you're probably well familiar with this idea of reactants, but it ends up that actually everybody has reactants, not just 3-year-olds and 16-year-olds, 35-year-olds and 65-year-olds also have reactants. And the reason why is we all want a sense of freedom and control. We all want to feel like we're in the driver's seat. Why did I buy something? Why did I use a certain service? Why do I hold a certain belief about abortion? I do it because that's what I feel like. I'm in the driver's seat. I've thought about it. I've sifted through the information. I've made a decision that fits with my values, my beliefs, my way of seeing the world, my religion, my politics, whoever I am, right? I've made that decision. I'm in the driver's seat. And that works really well, except then when we come along and we try to change their mind, and we try to push them in a particular direction, now it's not clear who's in the driver's seat, whether we're in the driver's seat, they're in the driver's seat, or we're in the driver's seat. The more they think about shifting to actually where we want them to go, the more they're going, well, hold on, am I going to where you want me to because I think that's a good idea or because you think it's a good idea? Because essentially, people have an ingrained anti-persuasion radar. It's almost like a missile defense system, like a spidey sense that goes off when they feel like someone's trying to change their mind. Right? And they engage in a set of defensive measures to avoid being persuaded. Some simple ones are avoid and ignore. Right? An ad comes on the television, we avoid it. We leave the room. An email comes in from a salesperson, we ignore it. That's easy. But even worse is counter arguing. Sure, someone might seem that they're listening to us. We're having a conversation where they're sitting there going, yeah, oh, good point. Yeah, thanks for saying that. But really what they're thinking in their heads is, no way. Right? Well, of course, you'd say that because that's what you believe. You represent an organization that believes this, that's consistent with your religion or your politics or your beliefs. But that's why you're saying it, because you believe it, right? But why should I believe it? Why is it good for me? Why does it fit with my beliefs, my way of seeing the world, my ideas, right? They're counter arguing, they're poking, they're prodding. Of course, you would bring up all these facts, but I could just as easily bring up a whole set of different facts that would show the exact opposite. Right? They poke and prod your argument till it comes crumbling down, almost like a high school debate team member. And so if pushing doesn't work, what does? We need to stop trying to persuade people and get them to persuade themselves. We need to stop trying to sell people so much. We're really good at selling people, right? But we need to get them to buy in. And to do that, I know that sounds like magic, but to do that, we need at the core to allow for agency. We need to give people back some of that sense of freedom and autonomy. We need to put them back in the driver's seat. We need to allow them to have control over their decision. Now, you might be sitting there going, well, how do I change someone's mind while also giving them control? So that's what we're going to talk about next. So I want to lay out a few different strategies. In the book, I think I talk about 5 or 6. Here, I'll talk about 2 or 3. Again, these aren't focused specifically on the domain of abortion. They're broader strategies, but I think you'll easily see how you can apply at least some of them to this situation and some of them to situations more broadly. I want to be careful. I'm not saying everything I'm going to say today is applicable to every situation out there, but it's like different tools, right? And I want us to see when to use these different tools and when some are useful and others are in different situations. And so the first way to allow for agency is to provide what I'll call a menu. And this one's really, really simple. Often when we try to get people to do something, we provide one course of action. I think you should do this. I think you should believe this. I think this is the right answer. Let me push you and give you more information and convince you till we get you to that right answer, right? You can think about the same thing as a salesperson. I think you should do X, right? In a meeting, they're talking about all the reasons why X is a really good idea. But as we've talked about, when you present one thing, people are sitting there going, well, this is what's wrong with that one thing. They spend all their time counter-arguing rather than listening to you, counter-arguing against what you're suggesting. And so what great catalysts, great change agents do is they don't just give people one option, they give them multiple. They say, well, I think you should think about X or Y. Which one do you think is better for you? Which one do you like better? Because doing that subtly shifts the role of the listener. Now, rather than sitting there thinking about all the reasons why they don't like what you've suggested, they've got a very different job. Now they're figuring out which of the things you suggested they like better. And because they're focused on which one they like better, they're much more likely to be persuaded at the end of the interaction. You can think about it as providing a menu, right? Because when you go to a restaurant, they don't just give you one option, they give you multiple options. But notice they don't give you unlimited options. Notice they don't say do whatever you want. They say, hey, choose from this limited set. But because you're given an option, because you're participating, you have agency in that process, you're much more engaged and much more bought in. Parenting experts talk about this all the time, right? You want your kid to eat their dinner and you tell them eat your broccoli. They say, no. Eat your chicken. No. Put on your pajamas. No. Right? Why are kids even saying no? They're saying no because they want a sense of freedom and control. They want to feel like they have agency. So what they talk about doing is give them an opportunity, right? Give them a menu. Give them called guided choice, right? Don't give them any option. Don't say you can do whatever you want. Say, okay, well, what do you want to do first? Put on your pajama top or your pajama bottom? What do you want to eat first? Your chicken or your broccoli? Which of these things do you want to eat for dinner? Among the things that are in the fridge that are options for dinner. Giving someone options, allowing them to choose from within that choice set will encourage them to feel that sense of freedom and agency, right? They're participating in the process. But notice I'm not saying give them any option. I'm suggesting encourage them to move in a particular direction, guide that journey, right? I like Janine saying an option-based approach to healing, right? Guide that journey, but allow them to participate in that journey. The more it's their journey, not just yours, the more bought in they'll be to that journey. And another way to do very much that same thing to get folks to buy in is to ask rather than tell. Too often we tell people, this is why you should do something. This is why this approach is the best thing. This is why this is the right answer, right? But statements, as we talked about, get people to put up that anti-persuasion radar and push back. And so what great catalysts, great change agents do is they ask questions rather than make statements. I was talking to a startup founder a couple of years ago, and she was having trouble motivating her team. She wanted people to stay late and work hard to put in extra hours, and nobody wanted to do it. And so she took a different tack. She took a different approach, right? Instead, she called a meeting. She said, hey, what kind of company do we want to be? Do we want to be a good company or a great one? You know how people answer that question. That one's really a rhetorical question. Everyone goes, a great company. And she goes, okay, great. How do we get there? And she starts having a conversation. People make different suggestions. They think about it. They talk about it. And then at the end of that conversation, she says, okay, great. Based on what we talked about, we're going to do X, Y, Z, right? Because questions do a few things. First, they encourage a dialogue between you and the person that you're trying to change. Sometimes we have all the information we need, but often we don't. Often we don't know enough about the person we're trying to change to get them to budge. So we have to understand them first. Questions allow us to get that understanding. It allows us to collect information and start with understanding rather than start with persuasion. Right? Hostage negotiators talk about this all the time. Novice negotiators want to start with persuasion. I just want to start to tell you to do what I want you to do. Do this thing, it's right. Right? Whereas expert negotiators start with the person they're trying to change. They start with understanding. Let me understand this person. Let me ask the right questions to understand them so I can help them and me get together to move in the right direction as a team. Questions do that. They allow you to collect that information. But what they also do Two more things. People are happy to answer questions because you're asking for their opinion. And once they've answered those questions, that encourages commitment to the conclusion. Because if I'm in that meeting and I say, oh, great, the best way to be a great company, we need to work a little harder. Now at the end of the meeting, when my boss says, hey, we need to work a little harder, I'm not going to say no, because I've already decided I'm part of that process. I've already decided I want to do that. Questions are very, very powerful, right? If you ask someone, how do you feel about this particular thing? What do you care about? What are the things that are important to you? You can then use that to help them see that the place you're trying to get them to is the same place that they wanted to get to in the first place. Not by you pushing them to get there, but by understanding where they want to go and using that to have a discussion that helps them realize that that's the best place for them, right? Not just giving them information, but starting with understanding and using questions to do that. Let me give you one more example of this, and then I'll transition to talking about distance. And by the way, I hope you see Ask, Don't Tell, I think is clearly valuable for you guys and basically everything that you do. Start by asking questions. What do you care about? What's important to you? What are your values? Asking the right questions. Notice, by the way, that boss didn't say, hey, do you like working on the weekend? Because everyone's going to say, no, I don't like working on the weekend. So it's not asking any questions. It's asking the right questions. Think about the right questions to guide that discussion the way that you want it to go, to focus it on the ways that you want it to, but using the understanding of the person you're trying to change to move that along. Right? Don't just tell them what to do, ask them and help them move in the right direction. And Jane is saying, hey, people are more clear about what they don't want to do rather than what they do. And that's fine. But you can ask them questions about what they don't want to do and why they don't want to do it and understand those things as being helpful. Let me give you a sort of version of this. It's a different strategy, but a sort of a version of this that I think is really key. And this is called highlighting a gap. And I want to show you an ad from Thailand that I think does this really well. And I want to use that to unpack the strategy. And then we'll talk about how to make it work. And so give me 1 second here. I want to make sure that I can share it to you with sound. Give me 1 second here. I'm going to hit the wrong button. So many buttons. Great. Share sound, optimize for video. Fantastic. We'll share that again. Great. So I want you to watch this video and then we'll spend a couple minutes talking about it. Okay, so here we go. So as mentioned, this is a campaign for a group called the Thai Health Promotion Foundation, an organization that wants to get people to quit smoking, but it had a lot of trouble getting traction, right? They were giving people information and facts and figures, and people weren't quitting. And so they were trying to figure out what to do. And so they did this campaign. And as mentioned in the video, this campaign was hugely successful, right? 40% increase in calls to the quit line. Videos of this campaign go viral, millions of views on the internet. And so hugely successful. But I think is more interesting is why this campaign was successful. And so let's spend a couple minutes talking about it. So any thoughts about why this campaign worked so well? Feel free to throw them in the chat. What made this campaign so successful? Any thoughts? Why was it so successful? Any ideas? Why did this work? Focus on themselves, not a child, children. Yeah, I want to be careful. It relates to children, but it's actually much deeper than using children. Subtitles are Burr, use children to persuade. Everyone admits you don't have innocence and provide an opportunity for self-reflection. Petra, yeah, good thought that Petra's getting at. So by the way, I agree this has children in it, but I can show you lots of examples of the same idea that don't have children in it. I think what Petra's getting at is quite interesting, right? What, and it may be others of you as well, but I saw Petra mention in particular. So the Tri Health Promotion Foundation realized that they didn't have an information problem. There are other situations where an information is a problem. They didn't have an information problem. Smokers knew all the information about why smoking was a bad idea. In fact, you can see it in these videos, right? Smokers know more about why you should quit smoking than doctors do. They listed all of them to the kids. You get emphysema and lung cancer and this and that. Don't you want to run and play, right? Smokers knew all the information. So it wasn't an information problem. So more information wasn't going to solve the problem. And what they realized is if they pushed people, people were going to push back. So instead of pushing people, they asked them, but they did something very specific. They did what's called highlighting a gap. What do I mean by that? Well, we want our attitudes and our actions to line up. If I say I care about the environment, I better recycle. If I say I care about a certain sports team, I better watch their games. When my attitudes and my actions don't line up, I do work to bring them in line. Why? Because a negative reaction occurs called cognitive dissonance, right? I don't want my attitudes and my actions to be separate. And so I do the work to bring them together. Same in this case, right? What the campaign did is it highlighted a gap between attitudes and actions. Hey, smoker, you just told this kid not to smoke, yet you smoke yourself. Is that what you want to be doing? Didn't tell the smokers what to do. Didn't tell the smokers to quit smoking, because you tell them to quit smoking, they're going to push right back. Instead, it encouraged smokers to realize that they weren't being completely consistent. And by encouraging them to be consistent, it encourages smokers to do the work and made change much more likely to happen. We can think about this in a variety of different situations. I'll give you one just at an office, but the same thing, you guys, anything really can be applied to the same idea. Well, I'll give you a different one. Let's talk about masks and vaccines, right? Rather than telling people, hey, wear a mask, hey, get vaccinated, which what people are going to do, they're going to push back, right? Instead, imagine saying, hey, would you want your elderly parent or grandparent to be vaccinated? Hey, would you want your young child to have the option to have others around them wearing masks? Would you want others to wear masks around your elderly parent or grandparent? Well, if you answered yes, okay, well, then why aren't you wearing one? Right? If you answered yes, you want to make sure your grandparents get the vaccine, your parents get the vaccine, well, then why wouldn't you want to get one too? Right? Not telling people, hey, do this, because people are going to say, no, I'm not interested in doing what you want me to do. Right? Instead, saying, encouraging them to come to it themselves, encouraging them to guide them down a journey that gets them there themselves. Okay, so that's various aspects of reactants. I won't have time today to talk about endowment. There's a whole chapter on it in the book, though, so feel free to check it out. By the way, there's also a whole bunch of resources. I haven't shared them. I guess I should do that. Well, I'll try to do this during the question session, but there's a bunch of resources on my website. If you just go to jonahberger.com/resources, a bunch of things you can download to help you think about these different aspects if you're interested in them. I want to spend a couple minutes on distance, and then I'll wrap up and take some questions. And in particular, I want to tell you about a study that was done a few years ago in politics. So everyone knows there's a big polarization gap in the United States, right? Conservatives think one thing, liberals think something else, big gap between them. And people argue that the gap is a gap due to conversation. People aren't talking, right? Filter bubbles. Republicans talk to other Republicans, Democrats talk to other Democrats. If we could just get people to talk to the other side, they'd come around. I use this example, by the way, because this doesn't sound like some of the things you guys are dealing with. I don't know what does, right? If we could just get people to talk to the other side, that'll work. Okay. And so a colleague of mine, his name is Chris Bale. He's a sociologist at Duke, did a really cool study. He goes on Twitter. He pays a bunch of people a little bit of money to follow someone on the other side, basically a bot from the other side. So Republicans get information about Democrats. Democrats get information about Republicans. They hope this is enough to bring people together. Right? The notion is just if talking is going to work, it'll bring people together. That's not what happened. Right? In fact, getting information about the other side made people more polarized, not less. How did it backfire? Right? Why didn't it work? And the reason it didn't work is this idea of distance, right? If you give people even information that's too far from where they are currently, they will ignore it. Not just when we're trying to persuade people, but even when we want to just give them information, even when it's an information problem. The challenge is if we give them information that's too far from where they are currently, they're not going to listen. Right? In the study I just mentioned, right, conservatives getting access to information about liberals actually made them more conservative. Boomerang, went in the opposite direction. And so how can we deal with this issue? Well, it is based on a very simple bias that happens called the confirmation bias. And in case it's helpful, here's an old example of it, famous example that was done many, many years ago. They had students who had gone to a football game. This was a game between, I think, Dartmouth and Princeton. Watch the game. And it was a very rough game. Lots of injuries, lots of penalties. Both sides had done some sort of nasty things. And students were asked who caused the problem, right? Is it, your school or the other school? You can guess what everybody said, right? Oh, the other school started it. Right? The Princeton student says it was the Dartmouth student's fault, the Dartmouth player's fault, and the Dartmouth students say it's the Yale player's fault, and everyone, a Princeton player's fault, and everyone thinks it's the other side, right? Because at the core, we have a bias where we confirm information that we believe, right? We look at new information, both search for new information as well as willingness to listen to information, depends on our existing beliefs, right? If I'm a Dartmouth student, the way I see a game is different than if I'm a Princeton student. If I'm a Dartmouth student and I see a Dartmouth student, Dartmouth player do something bad, I don't think it's that bad. But if I see the other side do something, oh, it's really bad, right? And the same thing holds with our willingness to look at new information. What information do I look at? And even if I see that information, do I consider it? Depends on where we are, our existing beliefs. You can almost think people as arrayed as positions on a football field, right? So think about this as a football field of political beliefs. It's easy to do, right? Far right is extremely conservative. Far left is extremely liberal. Wherever you are on the field is fine. You might put yourself on the conservative side of the field at the 25-yard line. But notice, regardless of where you are, you're still willing to listen to some things that are beyond where you are, but only so far beyond where you are, right? You may be willing to listen to things that are 5, 10, 15, even 25 yards in the other direction, but more than 50 yards, you're probably not going to listen to it. It's too far from where you are currently that you are unwilling to even consider the possibility of changing. Same with the other side, right? You may be on the more liberal side of the field, 25-yard line. You're willing to listen to information a little bit one way, a little bit the other, but not the other side. And same with the middle, right? Even if you're exactly middle, maybe 5 or 10 yards in each direction, but not things beyond that. Right? And so this willingness, this area of information we'll consider is called the zone of acceptance. And the points beyond that are called the regions of rejection. Right? And so one question we can ask ourselves is, how can we avoid this region of rejection? You can draw the same football field for exactly what you guys are dealing with, right? There are folks in the pro-life camp, and there are folks in the pro-choice camp, right? And there are folks of every way in between. Regardless of where someone is, they're not going to move 50 yards away from where they are tomorrow. That's so far from where they are currently that they're going to be unwilling to even listen to the possibility of changing. It's so far from where they are currently, it falls in the region of rejection. We ignore it. Don't even consider the possibility of changing. So how do we deal with that? Well, let me give you one solution. And this solution is called asking for less. So I was talking to a doctor, again, different domain, but I was talking to a doctor who was trying to get a truck driver to lose weight. This truck driver was obese, morbidly obese, right? Way overweight, hundreds of pounds overweight. Why? Because he was drinking over 3 liters of Mountain Dew a day, right? Lots of soda. That's like eating more than 30 Snickers bars a month, right? And what's our tendency in a situation like that? Well, we tell him to quit cold turkey, stop eating, stop drinking Mountain Dew, period. You got to quit. The only way you're going to lose weight. Notice, by the way, that we could say the same thing about us, right? We could say, hey, we want to move people right away. You've got to change your beliefs tomorrow. And so that's one way to go about it. But think about what that person's going to do. When that doctor says you've got to quit Mountain Dew, what's that trucker going to do? 1, not going to listen. And 2, find a different doctor. They're going to stop even being open to the possibility of listening. And so what the doctor cleverly did is she didn't tell him to quit Mountain Dew. She asked for less. She said, hey, look, I know you love Mountain Dew, and I understand it's delicious. So I'm not going to ask you to quit. But rather than drinking 3 liters a day, can we just try to move a little bit? Can we try to move from 3 liters to 2 liters a day? And you can fill up an empty bottle and put it in your cab with water. And the guy grumbled. He didn't want to do it. Right? Wasn't interested. Said, oh, I don't want to do it. Weeks, months went by. Finally, he was able to do it. He came back and said, Doc, I did it. I'm so proud. I went down to 2 liters. Right? But notice what she didn't do. She didn't stop there. She asked for more. She said, fantastic, you did a really good job. Now can you go down to 1? And he grumbled. He didn't want to do it. Weeks, months went by. Eventually he did it. Then she came back and she said, hey, can you move from 1 to 0? Right? And he grumbled. He didn't want to do it, but he did. And eventually he's lost over 30 pounds because she didn't just ask for less. She asked for less and then she asked for more. Essentially, what she did is she chunked the change. She took a big change and she broke it down into smaller chunks, right? Because big change isn't going to work. We ask people to move 50 yards on the field, they will ignore us. We ask them to move 5 yards, they don't want to move 5 yards. And we ask them to move 5 yards again, they won't move 5 yards, and 5 yards again, they move 5 yards, and eventually they've moved 50 yards. Big change doesn't happen overnight. Grand Canyon, let me tell you, the Grand Canyon didn't just one day there was the Grand Canyon. There was a couple drops of water that eventually became a stream, that eventually became a river, that eventually were a big groove in rocks that eventually became the Grand Canyon. Small changes eventually leading to big changes, right? Sometimes we've got small changes, easy to do. Sometimes we've got big changes, right? Big changes aren't going to happen overnight. We've got to chunk the change, use stepping stones, break big changes up into smaller chunks to make people more likely to move because they're more likely to listen. Okay, so I want to make sure to save at least a couple minutes for questions, so I'll wrap up and then take some questions. What do great catalysts do? Great catalysts reduce roadblocks. They don't push people harder. They don't provide more information, more facts, more figures. Yes, information sometimes is a good idea. And if your problem is information, information is a great solution. But let me tell you, your problem is not information as often as you think it is, right? And so we have to start by understanding the person that we want to change, figure out what the roadblocks are for them and removing them. We talked about a couple today. We talked about reactants. When pushed, people push back. Endowment, people don't want to let go of the past. Distance, when asked for something too far from where people are currently, they ignore us. Uncertainty, we didn't get to, but new things feel risky and uncertain. And so how can we make them feel safer? And corroborating evidence is about multiple sources of proof. I want to share 2 key next steps based on this conversation, and then I'd love to take the last 10 minutes or so for questions. First, we've got to get better at finding the parking brakes, right? We are so focused on the change we want to occur that we don't take the time to understand our audience. And if we don't understand our audience, it's going to be really hard to move them. Sometimes information is the parking brake. Sometimes people just need more information. Information is going to be a great solution. But other times, there are other brakes that are getting in the way. And if we don't understand them, it's going to be really hard to get people to move. And second, once we understand those parking brakes, we need to figure out how to mitigate them. Right? I've surveyed thousands of people. I've asked them for something they want to change and how to change it. And over 99% of the time, people list some version of pushing. We're so used to pushing that we have barrier blindness. We're unaware of the barriers to change. It makes it really hard to change them. But in case it's useful, as I mentioned, there's application guides on my website, just jonahberger.com/resources. That may take you to the page for resources to contagious. Just check out the Catalyst. It's a different book, a different page of resources on the site. There's some great guides there. Changing minds, changing behavior, moving people in the right direction, a one-pager to help you to think about these ideas. Because again, at the end of the day, it's not random, it's not luck, and it's not chance. There's a science behind why people change and why they don't. The better we understand the science of change, the more likely we can get people to move in the right direction, and the more likely we can to change anything. So thank you guys so much. I hope you found these ideas useful, and I'm more than happy to take questions. So let me do this. Let me open up the chat here. I'll do the chat first, and then I'll go to the Q&A. So please throw any questions in the chat. I see a question from Teddy. When they don't want to talk anymore, how do we reinitiate the discussion? Yeah, so I think the better question to start with, Teddy, it's a good question. But I think the question is, why don't they want to talk anymore? Right? Why don't they want to talk? Well, they probably don't want to talk because they know what we want to talk about, and they may not feel like we're either listening to them or they're interested in having that conversation. There's a great Heineken ad, if you haven't seen it. I think it's called Building a Bar or something like that. You can find it online, where they take 2 people that are diametrically opposed in their beliefs, and they try to see whether they can get them to see a little bit more eye to eye. So they take a transgendered person and people who think that transgendered people shouldn't have rights. They take someone who is quote unquote, man hater or really a feminist, just believes in rights for women, and someone who believes that men are superior to women. We could imagine doing the same thing in pro-choice and pro-life, right? Having 2 people who are like that. And you'd think that a person who's transgendered and a person who hates transgender people, doesn't think transgender people have rights, would not get along at all. And indeed, they wouldn't. But that's not how this conversation starts, right? Well, the conversation starts, right, is people start by getting together to solve a problem, but a different problem, not a problem about transgender rights. They have two people meet who have never met before, and they ask them to help build a bar out of different pieces. Right? And the end of building that bar, they work together for a period. They've thought about how to get, reach a common ground solution around this other thing that has nothing to do with their beliefs. At the end, they say, okay, great. Now we're going to show you what this other person believes. And they watch this video saying, oh my God, this other person believes completely different things than me. And at the end of the video, they're asked, okay, do you want to ignore this person now, or do you want to have a real conversation with them over a Heineken in this case? And some people say they don't want to talk to the person anymore, but most people are willing to have the conversation because they don't start with a difficult point. They don't start with a sticking point. They don't start with a point of disagreement. They start with an unsticking point. They start with common ground, a place of agreement, and they use that once you've built a bridge, once you've built a connection to eventually get to the more difficult discussions. And I would suggest the same thing here, right? Let's not start with the difficult stuff, right? Let's start by building a bridge, understanding someone, building trust and understanding. And only then, once we've built that, right, then get to some of the more difficult things because people will be more open to listen at that point. Okay, let me go to the Q&A here. Problem that is occurring is that pro-life people are standing elbow to elbow with pro-life abortion movement, life abortion, science anyway. Slides. So my above comment is trying to think about how to apply these principles to specific situations. It's not people in their homes who never see each other. It's happening. People elbow to elbow the march life and elsewhere in the same camp are treated with hate. Yeah. And so I think part of the challenge here is to think about, and I think your earlier comment was also, should we try to even more people join? Should we limit it to a smaller number? I think one thing I talk about in the distance chapter is we need to start with the movable middle. Right? Sure, we can start with people that are complete other end of the field. It's going to be really hard to get them to work. Or we can start with people that are already on board with some of the things we're talking about and move them a little bit in the right direction. I think that's a much more efficient and effective place to start. Right? Sure, if we need to move people on the other side, trying to do that. But rather than trying to do that, sort of build understanding and move people in the right direction, not the people that are diametrically opposed to us. That's going to be challenging to do, particularly in a short period of time. But move the people that are nearby in the right direction and eventually make change more likely. Awesome. Any more questions, either in the chat or otherwise? It doesn't look like it here. Is there a place in your acronym to help people save face? Yeah, I mean, people like to feel like, why do people care about saving face? They want to feel like they're the ones that made the change, right? That they changed because they wanted to, not because we wanted them to. And so the more they participate in that, the more like they feel like it's theirs, the more ownership they have over the process, the more it allows them to save face. And so I think that would certainly be in the Reactants chapter. Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. I hope you found these ideas useful. I hope you enjoy the book and the resources. And if there's anything else I can do to help, certainly let me know. It's really important to support women and to support them as they go through difficult times. And I hope these tools help you guys do even more of that great work. So thank you guys so much. Hope you guys enjoy the book and the resources as well. Thank you. Appreciate it.